Welcome to the Eat Well, Sleep Great, Run Far podcast. My name is Will Frantz, and I'm here to help you go farther, faster, and longer without injuries, gut problems, or giving up your favorite foods. This episode was originally recorded as a weekly live in the Trail and Ultra Running Nutrition group on Facebook. If you'd like to join these lives, watch past replays, or get any of the written summaries I do for these weekly, please head to the link in the show notes, drop me a comment. I'm happy to help you out. Now, let's get on with the episode. Sweet. We are live. So today is going to be kind of a frequently asked questions / Q&A style of thing. A couple of you asked questions in the group, and then I'm just going to address a couple things that people ask me very regularly about nutrition for trail and ultra stuff. So I'm going to start off with more of the frequently asked question style. The first question I get more often than anything else is, why do I always bonk or hit the wall at X miles? And more often than not, like 99+% of the time, you're out of fuel. You should eat more, and you probably should have eaten more about an hour ago. Specifically, you probably need to eat more carbohydrate. Like, I was training one athlete, and he was getting pretty much all of his carbohydrate from like quinoa and the occasional potato, and he was only eating about 125 grams of them per day. And then he'd go out for these like 6-hour efforts, and he wouldn't really eat much at all. And he'd hit a huge wall, like right around hour 3, and then he'd suffer the rest of his day. Might eat a Cliff Bar, like, of course, across the entire 6 hours he was out. And he was bonking because he was out of fuel. He needed to eat anything, but especially carbohydrate, and he would have struggled a lot less. So there are other strategies. You can get fitter. You can do some fat adaptation stuff, so you hold that off a little longer. You can go slower so that you don't like push as much into your glycogen stores, so you use a little more fat for fuel. But none of that is going to be nearly as quick and effective as just eating some carbohydrate and fueling appropriately. That athlete, like, his name's Tanner, he doesn't mind me sharing this, and he still eats pretty low carb most days, but when he goes out on a long effort, he brings some honey and Dr. Pepper, and he'll eat some fuel, and he hasn't bonked in months, last I talked to him. So if you eat some food, you are not going to hit the wall. Most common question number 2, and I'm actually going to lump a couple things together here because the answer is the same. So the most common question number 2 I get is like, why do I always start to get nauseous at mile X or mile Y? And then less common question, but it's going to be a very similar answer, is why do I struggle to eat at higher altitude, or why do I struggle to eat in the heat? And the answer to all 3 of those is you're very likely dehydrated. There are other answers, and these things are very personally dependent. But I almost promise you that if you were fine until like mile 40, and then suddenly you're not fine anymore, it is very likely a dehydration thing. Or if you're always okay on your training runs, and then you go to run in the heat, or you go into the mountains and run at altitude, that seems to have a huge effect on your stomach, then it is very likely a dehydration issue. First, dehydration adds up, over time. So even small hourly amounts of dehydration by the end of 12 hours can really cause a problem. So if you're getting like 40, 50, 60 miles into a race and you're struggling to keep down food or be able to eat anything, it is very likely that you have slowly been getting more and more dehydrated as the hours have passed by, and you have finally tipped over into this place where your stomach doesn't have enough blood anymore to digest your food. And while it might feel really sudden, it probably isn't. It is just this like tick over and like all of this accumulative dehydration that has been adding up for the entirety of your race. Now, heat and altitude, same deal. In the heat, you bleed more liquid, you lose more sweat, so it is harder to stay hydrated. So if you're constantly struggling with nausea and vomiting and heat, then it is very likely to be some level of a hydration issue more than it is a food issue. And same with altitude. At a higher altitude, it is harder to stay hydrated unless you're very well adapted to it. So if the altitude is another big trigger for you, then it is very likely a hydration issue more than it's a food choice issue. So I would say dial in your hydration, see where you are on that front, take a sweat test, and see if that fixes the problem. If not, then you might need to try some more easily digestible foods. You might need to like pace a little differently, but these would be like the big answer to all three of those questions tends to be a hydration thing. Now, a couple of the questions that I saw today in the group were, are bananas a good source of fuel during an ultra? Yep. A 7 to 8 inch banana has about like 25 grams of carbohydrates, which provides great fuel. They're fairly quickly digesting. It also has a good amount of potassium, which can help with muscle activation and could have a pretty positive effect in fighting cramps in a lot of people. They're also really portable. They don't need to be put in a bag, really. Like, I tend to have a lot of athletes use bananas as some part of their fueling strategy if they enjoy them and they're willing to do so. Some people hate bananas. It seems to be one of these like love or hate foods. So if you hate them, then clearly don't eat them. But it is a great source of fuel for a lot of people. I personally like the really little finger bananas because they're a little more portable, they're a little more nutrient dense. They actually can have a little more potassium. The problem is you have to eat more of them, and they're a little harder to peel. So just be aware of that before you switch to that on a race day. Now, another big thing, another question I got in my email was fiber. Like, should you eat fiber? When you eat fiber, it tends to seem to cause problems on race day, and all of that makes some sense. So a quick primer on fiber is there are two primary types, soluble and insoluble. Insoluble is found mostly in like vegetables, like things spinach and broccoli and carrots. Soluble is what you'd find in something like a whole grain, like oats. And a good mixture of the two tends to be pretty healthy for most people. Helps with good bowel movements and provides like good food for like a healthy gut microbiome, all the bacteria in your gut that keep you functioning. Now, it's not the only way to achieve those things, but it tends to be very beneficial for most people. That said, you can go overboard, although I almost promise you aren't, but you can go overboard on fiber. I will link a deep dive into fiber from someone I really respect named Sam Miller in the comments, but for our purposes here, just know that fiber tends to be quite healthy in your day-to-day life. Now, around race day, you likely want to reduce it. And that's because depending on the type, it can promote either constipation or diarrhea. And if you overload one direction or the other, you're likely to end up with problems. You're either going to be racing into the woods often or constantly feel backed up your entire race. Neither of those is likely to provide you with a high level of race performance, right? The amount you'd get from a banana or a white potato or some dates or even like a spring energy gel is not enough to really cause most people issues. But if you're eating leafy greens out on the trail, then you're likely going to end up with some problems. And this can track from like the 24 hours prior to your race as well. So if your race is on Saturday, you probably want to reduce your fiber intake a little bit on Friday. Now, fiber also takes a while to leave your stomach, so it'll sit in there longer. So if you eat some fiber before you go put in a hard effort, you're at a much higher risk for nausea and vomiting. So if you're struggling anyway, the banana might not be your best option. You might have to switch to liquid calories, and a large portion of that is going to be the fiber front. Same with the potato. Potato has some fiber. There's more fiber in its skin. So if you're really struggling, just flip the skin off before you eat it, and it might help you a little bit. Now, we have one fairly decent exception here, is like multi-day events. If you're doing like a 2, 3, 4 days straight, you are going to need to get some amount of fiber. It's going to need to be in a ratio that like lets you use the restroom appropriately over that amount of time. Um, that is going to be very personally dependent to you. Like everybody's fiber needs are actually fairly different, but a good way to do this would be to track it for a couple days, kind of know how much you intake, and then spread that across your day. And that should help you a little bit. But it really will take some dialing in. It would not surprise me if you are doing a multi-day event. If the first one you do, you have some gut problem, you have some like digestive tweaks, right? Like it's very unlikely that it's going to go off without a hitch. Another question I had was like, why am I getting sugar cravings? And there are a few answers. Like there's myriad answers here, right? I'm going to talk about three of them. Um, some people would tell you that you're too dependent on glucose and that you're crashing, so your brain is responding in kind of an addictive manner. And there's absolutely some truth to that. There's sugar in way too much shit these days, to be very blunt. And as a result, we're kind of constantly in this like elevated glucose state, and a lot of us end up fairly insulin resistant. So as soon as you remove that, glucose is great fuel for your brain kind of wants to know where it went, and it gives you a craving for more. So that is one thing that could be going on, but it is absolutely not the whole story. It's also possible that you're stressed because if you're trying to do a fairly high training volume and you have a life, then you have a good amount of stressors. And that doesn't mean they're all bad. It just means it's stress. So if you are having high levels of cortisol, your primary stress hormone, really good way to drop that is to eat carbohydrates, because when your insulin elevates, your cortisol drops. So if you are having food cravings for sugar and carbohydrate, it's very likely that is your body's way of telling you that you need to calm down. It's trying to regulate your stress. And again, it doesn't necessarily need to be bad stress. You don't need to feel like you're about to tear someone's head off in order to be in a state of stress. You could be on a very enjoyable 20-mile run in the woods with friends, but your cortisol is still elevated because you've run 20 miles. And if you don't do something to regulate it, then you're very likely going to get some cravings for sugar or a crash or something that tells you you need to monitor and like regulate your cortisol. And another option is that you're just under fueling in general. Most sweet things are fairly calorically dense. So like a serving of rice is almost a cup of rice. A serving of sugar is a tablespoon, maybe two. So we really like it is just so dense. It is such a dense form of calories. So if you are under fueling, your body's going to tell you to get more calories in so it can stay stable, so it can stay in what we call homeostasis. Now, this is complicated by the fact that a lot of like high sugar or high carb foods, think potato chips, candy bars, etc., are also pretty high in fat a lot of the time. So it's not just a great source of carbohydrate, it's also a great source of fat and a great source of calories in general. So if you're having a lot of these cravings, you might be under fueling, you might be stressed, you might be insulin resistant, could be more things than that, but it doesn't necessarily indicate, the craving isn't necessarily an indicator that it's bad. The craving is a signal that you need to do something. Now, what that is really going to depend on you. If you're worried that you're under fueling, track your food for a few days, kind of see where you are. If you want me to look at it, happy to do that. If you're stressed, kind of figure that out. If you are saving all of your carbohydrates till nighttime, so if you're only eating like 150 grams of carbs and you're eating 125 of them in the last chunk of your day, that would make some sense. Spread it out a little more, add a little more. That can help regulate throughout your day so you don't end up in this gigantic cortisol spike and then needing to plummet before you go to bed. And then as far as like the insulin resistance thing, you should be able to go for a little while without food. I'm not saying you should, I'm not saying you should train in that state, but you should be able to make it partway through your day without this need for food. And if we aren't able to fast at all, you probably have some level of insulin resistance. So Those are three things to look for. It could be none of those things. Sugars, sugar cravings are, again, myriad, but these are some options. Now, another question I got was like, what is the most like important aspect of a training plan? How do I look at a good training plan if I'm just getting going? Like, what do I know is good? And it's tough. But like the three big factors of any training plan are going to be frequency. So like how often you're running for a running plan, volume, the total amount of distance or time you're running, and intensity, like how fast or how hard you're pushing. Now, if you are just getting started, frequency is almost certainly the most important. Now, this is because running is a skill. It is a particularly complicated and difficult skill. Our ability to run is actually one of the reasons we kind of evolved to top of the food chain. And a lot of us forget that because we used to kind of run around willy-nilly as children and it felt really easy. Then we don't do it for a long time and we come back to it as an adults and it's hard. Now, like a lot of things in life, you either use it or lose it. If you've ever watched a child squat, they drop into this like perfect squat with no effort. I can't do that. It's taken me years to like build the squat I have, and it still doesn't look as good as a 2-year-old's. So unless you've been running long distances consistently for a few years, you're probably just not great at the skill of running. And frequency allows you to practice the skill. It also allows you to practice the skill when you're less fatigued and in a way that won't reinforce bad habits. If you do 30 minutes 5 or 6 times a week, you'll get a bunch of time to practice the skill of running when you're relatively fresh and you can actually focus on what you're doing. Now, if you go on one 3-hour run every Saturday, you're likely to get tired at some point, especially if you're starting out. And unless you're already pretty good at the skill of running, you might be doing more harm than good because you might just be reinforcing things like bad running form, bad habits, and like causing more issues down the line. Now, if you've already been running for a long time, it's less important. So some people will talk about, I've been running for 20 years and I really only run a couple times a week and then I run ultras. It makes a lot of sense because they have a lot of practice at the skill. So the volume and the intensity really become paramount for them. But if you're just getting started, frequency matters more than almost anything else. Now, you don't need to push yourself into overtraining. You don't need to force yourself to streak or run 6 days a week if you don't like have it in you. Build it up. If you run every day with no regard for your health or form of recovery, you're probably going to get hurt. Now, if you're taking good care of yourself, you can run as often as you'd like. But try to get out there, run often. When we're looking at skill practice, something like 10 or 15 minutes really does count. It counts anyway because it's a run and like we should count our wins, but it especially counts when we're talking skill work. 10 to 15 minutes counts. It will help you. Which brings me like one last thing I'm going to talk about today. How do I know if I'm overtraining or under recovering? This is a much longer topic that I would like to do a much deeper dive on, right? So this is not going to be a full response, but very simply, it's like, how do you feel? Do you feel like crap? Do you always feel bad after a race? Listen to your body. Tools can be helpful. So like I wear an Oura ring. It tells me my HRV and like gives me some assessment of my sleep. I've been wearing it for many years, so like the trends on it are fairly accurate at this point, but it's not omniscient, right? Like if I don't care what this thing tells me. If I feel terrible, I need to do something. You should feel good most of the time. And if you're constantly feeling terrible, something's wrong. You're either pushing into overtraining, or your stress has taken a jump, or you're not eating enough. You should have some energy. You should be in a decent mood, probably a good mood. You should have a libido. But if you feel like garbage all the time, something is wrong. So if you don't feel good, assess whether you're overtraining, assess whether you're under recovering, see what's going on. And that's really what I have for today. I'm going to do another one of these fairly soon with some more topics, but I need to get going. And I hope you all found that helpful, and I will post a replay of this shortly. Hope you have a really good rest of your night, and I will talk with you soon. Thank you for listening to the show. To be clear, I'm not a doctor nor a registered dietitian, and nothing you heard was medical advice. You should always speak with a qualified medical professional before making any changes to your training regimen. If you enjoy the podcast or found it useful, please take a couple seconds to give it a rating or share it with a friend. Every little bit helps. And if you want more of this information, please head to the Trail and Ultra Running Nutrition group on Facebook. You'll be in good company with other like-minded people who like to do hard stuff outside.